She smiled when she heard the number $85 million, as if my life had already been erased from it. I remember the exact way Vanessa crossed her legs in that leather chair, her posture relaxed, her lips curled into that quiet, confident smirk she had perfected over the years. It was the kind of smile that didn't need words, the kind that said she had already won. The conference room was too cold, or maybe it just felt that way because I was sitting there alone on one side of the long polished table, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching my own family prepare to divide a life I had spent 42 years building. My husband had been gone for just 10 days. 10 days since the house fell silent. 10 days since the man who used to fill every room with his steady presence had disappeared, leaving behind echoes in the walls and a name that now sat printed at the top of a very expensive stack of documents. Across from me, my son Daniel didn't look at me. He hadn't really looked at me since the funeral. He was staring instead at the attorney, at the papers, at anything that didn't require him to acknowledge the woman who raised him. And next to him, Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her manicured fingers resting lightly on the table as if she already belonged there, as if everything on that table was already hers. I didn't say anything. I hadn't said much in days. Silence, I've learned, unsettles people far more than anger ever could. The attorney, Mr. Collins, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his voice calm, professional, practiced. He began reading the standard formalities, the language of law that sounds important but feels distant, like it belongs to someone else's life. I watched Vanessa instead. The way her eyes flickered with anticipation. The way she exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, subtle but certain. They had talked about this, planned for this, counted on this. And for a moment, I let myself look exactly like what they believed I was. A grieving widow. A woman who had just lost her place in the world. A woman who didn't understand what was coming next. It wasn't difficult. Grief has a way of making stillness look like weakness. But inside, something else was happening. Something much quieter. Much colder. Because grief, when it settles deep enough, doesn't just break you. Sometimes it sharpens you. I thought about the last conversation I had with my husband, the way he had held my hand just a little tighter than usual, the way he had looked at me like he wanted to say something more, but chose not to. At the time, I thought it was just fear. Now, sitting in that room, watching Vanessa's smile grow wider with every passing second, I understood it differently. Mr. Collins turned a page. The sound was soft, almost insignificant. But I noticed it. I noticed everything. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I wasn't waiting to hear what I would receive. I already knew something they didn't. And I was patient enough to let them keep smiling just a little longer. 48 hours earlier, the house had been so quiet that even the ticking of the kitchen clock felt too loud, like it was marking time in a place that no longer belonged to the living. And I remember standing by the window with a cup of coffee I never finished, staring out at the long driveway my husband used to clear every winter himself, even when we could easily afford help. Because he always said a man should take care of what he built with his own hands, and that sentence stayed with me. Longer than anything else after he was gone, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he had looked at me when he said it, steady and certain, as if he knew something I did not, as if he was preparing me for a moment I had not yet reached. And that morning I noticed something else too. Something small but sharp, like a splinter you cannot see but cannot ignore. Because Daniel had called the night before, and his voice had been different. Not grieving, not even tired, just distant, practical, asking questions about documents, about accounts, about things that could have waited, and Vanessa had been in the background. I could hear her voice faintly, not speaking to me but speaking through him, guiding him, shaping his questions, and that was when the quiet in the house shifted from loneliness to awareness, because loneliness feels empty but awareness feels full, heavy, like something is about to unfold, whether you are ready or not. And I walked through each room slowly that morning, the living room where we hosted holidays, the dining room where laughter used to linger long after the plates were cleared, the study where he spent hours reviewing investments and contracts, and I realized how many of those spaces had already begun to feel like memories instead of places, as if someone had quietly decided they no longer belonged to me, and I did not cry. Not then, because crying would have meant I was surprised, and I was not entirely, because over the past few years I had watched Vanessa carefully, the way she inserted herself into decisions that were never hers to make, the way she smiled just a little too politely when I spoke, the way Daniel gradually stopped asking for my opinion and started informing me of outcomes instead, and at the time I told myself it was normal, that families change, that sons grow up and build lives of their own, but standing there in that silent house I understood something else, something much clearer. That change is one thing, but replacement is another, and I had been slowly replaced without ever being told it was happening, and still I said nothing because silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is preparation, and later that afternoon when Mr. Collins called and asked if he could meet me privately before the formal reading, I did not hesitate. I simply said yes in the same calm voice I had used for decades, because by then I already knew that whatever was coming next would not be decided in that cold conference room with polished wood and rehearsed expressions. It had already been decided long before anyone sat down at that table, and all that remained was to let everyone else realize it. Mr. Collins did not invite me to his office the way most attorneys do, with polished formality and carefully measured distance. Instead, he asked me to meet him at a smaller conference room on the second floor of a quiet building just outside downtown, a place that felt deliberately unremarkable, as if whatever he needed to say was not meant to echo beyond those walls. And when I arrived, he was already there, standing by the window with a folder in his hands, not looking at his watch, not rushing me, just waiting. Which told me more than any greeting could have, because people who are about to deliver ordinary information do not prepare themselves like that. They do not choose quiet rooms or stand in silence rehearsing their words. They simply speak, but this was different. I could feel it before he even turned around. And when he finally did, his expression was not just professional, it was careful. The kind of careful that comes from carrying something that could change the direction of someone's life. And he gestured for me to sit, not across from him, but beside him at the table, which was another detail I noticed, another small shift that told me this was not going to be a conversation built on distance. And for a moment neither of us spoke. The room was still except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, and I placed my hands in my lap the same way I had at the house, steady, composed, because whatever he was about to say, I intended to hear it clearly, without interruption, without emotion clouding it. And when he finally opened the folder, he did not begin with legal language. He began with my husband's name, spoken in a tone that carried respect rather than routine. And then he said something that made everything inside me go completely still. He said, "Your husband anticipated conflict," and I did not ask him what he meant because I already understood the direction of that sentence. I understood it in the same quiet way I had begun to understand everything else over the past 2 days. Not through explanation, but through pattern, through memory, through the accumulation of moments that had not made sense until now. And he continued, explaining that several months before my husband passed, he had requested an amendment, a codicil, something that would not be discussed openly until the formal reading, something that was meant to remain completely confidential, even from family members. And I watched his hands as he spoke, the way he handled the document with precision, as if even now it required care. And then he looked at me directly and said he wanted to make sure I was prepared, not for the legal outcome, but for the reaction that would follow. And that was the moment I realized this was never just about money. It was about behavior, about choices, about what people reveal when they believe they are safe from consequences. And I felt something shift inside me. Not shock, not even relief, but clarity, a clean, steady clarity that settled into place like something finally understood. And I nodded once, slowly, because there was no need for more, no need for questions or reassurance. Everything I needed to know was already there between his words. And as he closed the folder, he said one final thing, that my husband trusted me to handle what came next in my own way. And I stood up, thanked him, and walked out of that quiet room with the same calm expression I had worn when I entered, because by then I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to say nothing. I was going to change nothing, and I was going to let them believe every assumption they had already made. I drove home from that meeting with Mr. Collins in complete silence, not even turning on the radio, because I needed to hear my own thoughts without interruption. And as the road stretched out in front of me, I began to revisit moments I had once dismissed, Small things that at the time felt insignificant, but now aligned with unsettling precision, like pieces of a pattern that had always been there waiting for me to recognize it. And the first memory that surfaced was from nearly a year ago. A dinner at our house where Vanessa had insisted on reorganizing the seating arrangement at the last minute, smiling as she gently suggested that I take the chair at the far end of the table because it would be more comfortable, even though it was the seat I had never occupied in decades of hosting. And I remember Daniel agreeing without hesitation, not even noticing the shift, or perhaps choosing not to notice it. And I had laughed it off then, told myself it was nothing, just a preference, just a younger woman trying to be helpful. But now I understood that it was not about comfort. It was about position, about slowly moving me away from the center of my own home. And then there were the financial discussions that had begun to happen without me, meetings Daniel would mention only after decisions had already been made, phrases like "we thought it would be easier this way" or "Vanessa has been helping me organize things," always delivered with that same careful tone that sounded respectful on the surface but carried something else underneath, something final, something that did not invite input. And I remembered the afternoon I had asked about one of our investment accounts, and Daniel had hesitated before answering, glancing briefly at Vanessa, as if confirming what he was allowed to say. And she had stepped in smoothly, explaining details I should have already known, her voice calm, controlled, practiced, and I had nodded, thanked her, told myself it was efficient, that it made sense for them to take on more responsibility. But standing in my kitchen that evening after returning from the meeting, I realized how deliberate it had all been, how each moment had built upon the last, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a quiet erosion that only becomes visible once the structure has already begun to weaken. And I walked into my husband's study then, a room I had not entered since the funeral, and everything was exactly as he had left it. The desk neatly arranged, the leather chair pushed in, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air, and I stood there for a long time, not touching anything, just looking, remembering the countless evenings he had spent in that room reviewing documents, making decisions, building the life that now sat at the center of this unfolding situation. And I thought about what Mr. Collins had said, about anticipation, about preparation, about the idea that my husband had seen something I had only begun to understand after he was gone. And instead of feeling anger, I felt something much quieter, a sense of alignment, as if I was finally stepping into a role that had been waiting for me. And I made a decision then, a simple one but absolute. I would not confront Daniel. I would not question Vanessa. I would not reveal what I knew, because truth, when revealed too early, loses its weight. And I wanted them to carry their certainty all the way to the moment it would collapse. I wanted them to sit in that confidence, to build it, to rely on it. And so I turned off the light in the study, closed the door behind me, and returned to the silence of the house, not as a woman who had been pushed aside, but as someone who had finally begun to see the full shape of what was happening, and who was willing to wait for the exact moment to respond. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of slow, quiet morning that would have once felt peaceful but now carried a different weight, a quiet awareness that something irreversible was already in motion. And I moved through the house with the same deliberate calm I had adopted since my meeting with Mr. Collins, making coffee, setting a single place at the kitchen table, folding my napkin the same way I had done for years. Because routine has a way of anchoring you when everything else begins to shift. And as I sat there, I let my mind return not to what had been said, but to what had not been said over the past year. The pauses, the omissions, the subtle redirections that at the time seemed harmless, but now revealed themselves as something much more intentional. And I remembered the afternoon Vanessa had suggested consolidating several of our accounts to make things easier for Daniel, her words carefully chosen, her tone warm but firm, as if she was offering help while quietly establishing control. And I had agreed without resistance, trusting that efficiency was the goal, trusting that family meant shared responsibility. But now I could see how that moment had shifted something fundamental, how it had given her visibility into structures she had no reason to oversee, and how Daniel had allowed it without question, not out of malice perhaps, but out of convenience, out of the ease of letting someone else manage what he did not want to think about. And then there were the documents that began arriving addressed to both of them instead of to me, Small changes in wording that most people would overlook, but that carried a deeper implication, as if ownership itself was being redefined line by line. And I recalled the way Vanessa would occasionally ask questions that sounded casual but were anything but questions about timelines, about contingencies, about what would happen in certain scenarios, always framed as curiosity, always delivered with a smile. And I had answered them then with openness, never imagining that each answer was being filed away, stored, and eventually used to construct a version of reality where I no longer occupied the center. And sitting there at the table that morning, I understood that nothing about this had been rushed, nothing had been accidental. It had been patient, measured, and deliberate, built over time in a way that made it almost invisible until the final stage was already in place. And yet, despite that realization, I did not feel panic. I did not feel the need to act immediately, because urgency belongs to those who are uncertain, and I was no longer uncertain. I had been given something far more valuable than control. I had been given clarity, and clarity changes the way you move through the world. It removes the impulse to react and replaces it with the discipline to wait. And so when Daniel called later that afternoon to confirm the time of the reading, his voice composed, almost rehearsed, I responded in the same calm tone I had used for decades. I told him I would be there. I asked no questions. I offered no opinions. And when I hung up the phone, I allowed myself a single moment of stillness, not to doubt, not to reconsider, but to recognize the exact position I now held, because for the first time since my husband passed, I was not standing in the shadow of decisions being made around me. I was standing at the center of something they did not yet understand, and I intended to let them walk into it exactly as they were, confident, certain, and completely unprepared for what was waiting on the other side. By the time the morning of the reading arrived, everything felt unusually precise, as if every movement, every decision, every word spoken in that house had been leading to a single point that could no longer be delayed. And I dressed slowly, choosing a simple navy dress that I had worn to more than one important occasion, not because I wanted to make an impression, but because it reminded me of who I had always been, steady, composed, and present. And as I fastened the clasp of my necklace, I caught my reflection in the mirror and noticed something that had not been there in the days immediately after my husband passed. Not grief, not softness, but clarity, the kind that sharpens your posture, the kind that settles into your expression in a way that does not need explanation. And when I walked downstairs, the house was just as quiet as it had been all week, but it no longer felt empty. It felt still, as if it was waiting, and I left without hesitation, locking the door behind me with a sense of finality that I did not question, because I understood that whatever happened next would mark a boundary between what had been and what would remain. And when I arrived at the office building, the parking lot was already partially filled. Daniel's car parked near the entrance, which told me he had arrived early, something he rarely did unless he felt the need to be in control of a situation. And as I stepped inside, I saw them before they saw me. Daniel standing near the reception desk, speaking quietly with Vanessa, his posture slightly tense, her demeanor relaxed, confident, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if to steady him, or perhaps to remind him of the version of events they had already accepted as truth. And I approached without changing my pace, without announcing my presence. And when they finally turned toward me, Vanessa's smile appeared instantly, polished and practiced, the same expression she used at social gatherings when she wanted to appear gracious. And she stepped forward just enough to acknowledge me, but not enough to close the distance between us. And I returned the gesture with a small nod. Nothing more, because there was nothing left to exchange in that moment that would alter what was about to happen. And we moved together toward the conference room in near silence, the sound of our footsteps soft against the carpet, the air carrying that faint scent of polished wood and paper that always accompanies legal spaces. And when we entered the room, everything was already prepared, the documents neatly arranged, the chairs positioned with intention, and Mr. Collins stood at the head of the table, his expression neutral but attentive. And I took my seat without hesitation, the same seat I had chosen days earlier, placing my hands gently in my lap, allowing the stillness to settle around me. And across the table, Vanessa sat with a quiet confidence that had only grown stronger, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, as if she was already anticipating the outcome, already stepping into a future she believed had been secured. And Daniel avoided my eyes again, focusing instead on the papers, on the process, on anything that allowed him to remain detached from the reality of what this moment represented. And I watched them both without judgment, without anger, simply observing, because this was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment they believed would confirm everything they had assumed. And I understood something then with absolute certainty. That anticipation can be blinding when it is built on incomplete understanding. And as Mr. Collins cleared his throat and reached for the first page, I felt no urgency, no fear, only a quiet, unwavering patience, because unlike everyone else in that room, I was not waiting to find out what would happen. I was waiting for them to finally understand what already had. Mr. Collins began with the formal language, the kind that fills the room without truly touching anyone in it, phrases about testamentary intent and legal standing that drifted across the table like background noise, and I watched as Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on every word, while Vanessa remained relaxed, her posture unchanged, her confidence untouched by the slow pace of the reading, because in her mind the outcome had already been decided long before any document was opened, and I could see it in the way her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, not tense, not uncertain, but assured, as if she was simply waiting for the confirmation of something she had already claimed as her own. And I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my gaze steady, not on the papers, not on the attorney, but on the subtle shifts in expression that revealed far more than the words being spoken. And as the minutes passed, Mr. Collins moved through the initial distributions, the predictable allocations, the charitable contributions, the structured assets that had been outlined years earlier, and I noticed the way Daniel's shoulders began to ease, the way Vanessa's smile grew just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as each expected detail aligned with what they had assumed, reinforcing the narrative they had built together. And there was a moment when Vanessa allowed herself a brief glance in my direction, not long enough to be overt, but long enough to register. A glance that carried quiet satisfaction, as if acknowledging a conclusion she believed I had already accepted, and I did not react, because reaction would have disrupted the rhythm, and the rhythm was important. It was carrying them forward exactly as it needed to, and Mr. Collins continued, his voice even, controlled, giving nothing away beyond the text in front of him, and then he reached a point where the structure of his reading shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately signal change to anyone who was not paying close attention. But I noticed it in the way his tone adjusted, in the slight pause before he turned the page, in the way his hand rested for just a fraction longer on the document before moving forward. And it was in that moment that the room itself seemed to settle into a deeper silence, the kind that forms just before something is revealed. And Vanessa did not notice. She remained composed, her expression unchanged, her confidence intact. Because anticipation can dull perception when it is too certain of its outcome, and Daniel glanced briefly at Mr. Collins, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face, but it passed quickly, replaced again by expectation, and I sat there, completely still, aware of every detail, every shift, every breath, because this was no longer about listening, it was about timing, and timing, when handled correctly, has a way of turning certainty into something far more fragile. And as Mr. Collins finally lifted his gaze from the page, looking not at Daniel, not at Vanessa, but directly at me, I felt no change in my posture, no surge of emotion, only a quiet acknowledgement that the moment we had all been moving toward had finally arrived, and I allowed the silence to hold for just a second longer before anything else could be said, because sometimes the space before the truth is spoken carries more weight than the truth itself. Mr. Collins did not speak immediately after looking up, and that pause, brief as it was, shifted something in the room that even Vanessa could not ignore, because silence, when it comes from someone in control, has a way of demanding attention without asking for it, and I watched as her fingers tightened just slightly against the table, not enough to betray her confidence completely, but enough to reveal that something had changed, something she had not anticipated, and Daniel leaned forward. Again, his earlier ease replaced by a faint tension that returned to his shoulders, his eyes moving between the attorney and the document as if trying to locate the moment where expectation had begun to slip, and then Mr. Collins spoke, his voice as calm as it had been from the beginning, but now carrying a different weight, a clarity that no longer needed to be softened by routine language, and he explained that an additional provision had been added to the estate, one that had been executed in full legal standing several months prior, one that was to be disclosed only at this stage of the reading. And I did not move. I did not look at Vanessa. I did not look at Daniel, because I already knew what was coming, and I understood that their reactions would unfold without my participation. And as Mr. Collins continued, the words began to take shape in the air between us, not rushed, not dramatic, but precise, outlining a condition tied not to time, not to circumstance, but to behavior. And I saw the moment Vanessa's expression faltered, not fully, not yet, but enough that the certainty behind her smile no longer held the same structure, and Daniel's confusion became more visible now, his brows drawing together slightly as he tried to follow the shift in direction, because what was being read did not align with the version of events they had constructed. And Mr. Collins turned another page, his movement steady, deliberate, and then he read the clause in full, the condition that any direct beneficiary who had acted in a manner that diminished, excluded, or publicly disrespected the surviving spouse would forfeit their claim entirely, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that did not need emphasis, because their meaning was unmistakable. And for the first time Vanessa looked directly at me, not with confidence, not with satisfaction, but with something else, something searching, as if she was trying to measure whether what she was hearing could still be undone. And I met her gaze without expression, because there was nothing left to convey, nothing left to negotiate, and Mr. Collins continued without pause, confirming that under the terms of this provision the primary estate, including all major assets and controlling interests, was to remain solely with me, unrestricted, complete, and final. And Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair as if the space around him had shifted, as if the ground he had been standing on had quietly moved without warning, and Vanessa said nothing, her composure held in place by habit rather than certainty now, and I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, still, composed, present, because this was not the moment I had been waiting for, this was simply the moment they had finally arrived at. No one spoke after Mr. Collins finished, not immediately, because the kind of silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense with realization, with recalculation, with the quiet collapse of assumptions that had been built too confidently, and I watched as Vanessa's posture changed almost imperceptibly, the ease that had defined her presence only minutes earlier now replaced with a stillness that felt different, not composed but contained, as if she was holding something in place that no longer had structure. And Daniel's eyes moved again, not to the documents this time, but to me, searching, uncertain, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in a long while, and I did not respond to that look, because acknowledgement was not necessary. Understanding does not always require words, and Mr. Collins closed the folder with a quiet finality, the sound soft but definitive, marking the end of something that had been anticipated very differently by everyone except me, and I allowed a breath to settle naturally before I moved, not rushed, not hesitant, simply rising from my chair with the same calm I had carried into the room, and as I stood Vanessa finally spoke, her voice controlled but thinner than before, asking a question about interpretation, about whether the clause could be reviewed again, whether there was context that might alter its application. And Mr. Collins answered with the same steady professionalism, explaining that the language was explicit, that the conditions had been clearly defined and legally executed, that there was no ambiguity to reinterpret, and I watched as that answer settled over her. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, and Daniel said my name then, quietly, as if testing whether it still held the same place between us, and I turned my head just enough to acknowledge him, not fully, not with warmth or distance, simply with presence, because that was all that remained to be offered. And for a moment it seemed as though he wanted to say more, to explain, to justify, but the words did not come, and that absence spoke more clearly than anything he might have attempted, and I reached for my bag, lifting it with steady hands, aware of every movement but attached to none of it emotionally, because this was not a moment for reaction, it was a moment for conclusion, and as I stepped away from the table I allowed myself a single glance across the room, not at Vanessa, not at Daniel, but at the space itself, the polished surface, the documents, the chairs, the setting where everything had been revealed without confrontation, without raised voices, without anything other than truth presented at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. And then I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, saying that my husband had always been a careful man, that he understood people better than they realized, and that he had simply chosen to let time reveal what words never could, and I did not wait for a response because none was needed, and I turned toward the door, walking out of the room with the same steady pace I had carried from the beginning, leaving behind not just the conversation but the version of myself they had believed in, because the person they thought would leave that room diminished had never truly been there at all. And as I stepped into the hallway, the air felt lighter, not because anything had been gained, but because everything had finally been seen for what it was. And for the first time since my husband passed, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not of victory, not of satisfaction, but of certainty, the kind that does not need to be shared, because it already belongs exactly where it should.